The calm evening air was shattered by the sharp wail of sirens and the piercing flash of blue and red lights. Liam Carter's grip on the steering wheel tightened instinctively as he glanced at the rearview mirror. A police cruiser was tailing him, its headlights glowing like twin beacons of judgment. He sighed deeply, his exhaustion from a long day at work replaced by a sense of dread. Slowing his sedan, he pulled over to the side of the road. The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Greg Harris emerged from the cruiser. His deliberate strides and stern expression exuded authority. Liam rolled down his window, maintaining a composed demeanor despite the unease creeping into his chest. "License and registration," Harris barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Liam nodded and reached for his glove compartment, moving slowly to avoid any misunderstanding. His actions were calm, but the undercurrent of tension was undeniable. Handing over his documents, he offered a polite, "Here you go, officer." Harris stared at the papers in silence, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he finally asked. Liam's brows knitted. "Not exactly, officer. Was I speeding?" "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Harris snapped. His tone carried a sharpness that felt disproportionate to the minor infraction. Liam frowned slightly but nodded. "I see. My apologies if I missed the mark." Harris's eyes lingered on Liam, scrutinizing every detail of his tailored suit and composed demeanor. The seconds stretched uncomfortably as the officer seemed to debate his next move. Finally, he leaned closer to the window, his voice dropping slightly. "You're not from around here, are you?" Liam's jaw tightened at the implication, but he kept his response measured. "I've lived here for a few months. My address is on the license." Harris didn't seem to hear him. His questions took on an accusatory edge, the underlying message clear despite the lack of overt statements. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Liam replied evenly. The air between them grew heavier with unspoken tension. Harris lingered a moment longer, then stepped back, folding the documents deliberately. His next words came with a faintly smug tone. "Step out of the car for me." Liam hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Is there a specific reason, officer?" "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be," Harris replied, his voice dripping with implied threat. Liam exhaled slowly and opened the door, stepping out into the fading light. The encounter was no longer about a traffic violation. It had become something far more personal. Liam stepped out of his car, his polished shoes making a soft tap against the asphalt. His tailored suit hugged his broad shoulders, presenting a stark contrast to the casual aggression radiating from Officer Harris. The officer's eyes flicked over Liam, his expression unreadable, but his posture unmistakably assertive. "Hands where I can see them," Harris ordered, his voice sharp. Liam complied, raising his hands calmly. "Of course, officer. Is there a particular concern I should be aware of?" Harris smirked faintly, the kind of smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Just routine," he said curtly. "We've had incidents in this area." "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans?" Liam asked, his tone polite but pointed. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harris's smirk faded, replaced by a subtle tightening of his jaw. "Watch your tone," he said, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully comfortable with how this works. You got something to hide?" Liam's gaze remained steady. "Not at all, officer. I simply believe in understanding the reasons behind any interaction." Harris took another step forward, his chest puffed slightly as if to assert dominance. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" "I don't think anything, officer," Liam replied calmly. "I just believe fairness is important." Harris's lips twitched, but he masked whatever reaction had momentarily surfaced. "Fairness," he echoed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "People like you always—" He stopped abruptly, his own words hanging in the air. Liam tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging but his posture somehow shifting. Subtle, unthreatening, yet commanding. "People like me?" he repeated, his voice calm but charged. Harris stiffened, realizing too late the implication of his unfinished thought. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. "I think I do," Liam said evenly. There was no anger in his voice, but the weight of his words was undeniable. Harris seemed momentarily thrown off balance. But he recovered quickly, pacing in a small circle as though trying to regain control. His fingers tapped absently against the holster on his belt, a nervous reflex that didn't go unnoticed. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Harris said suddenly, his voice clipped and authoritative. "I need to check for weapons." Liam raised an eyebrow, incredulity flickering across his face. "Weapons?" he repeated, his tone measured. "Do I look like someone carrying a weapon?" Harris's jaw tightened. "I'm not going to ask again." For a moment, Liam hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his expression. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat on the hood of his car. Harris approached, his boots crunching on the asphalt. His movements were quick and rough, his hands patting Liam down with an intensity that felt more invasive than necessary. "You're clean," Harris muttered finally, stepping back. His tone carried irritation, as if he was annoyed he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. Liam turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. Harris's frustration was palpable as he stepped back, his hand resting on his belt like a symbol of authority he felt slipping through his fingers. He stared at Liam as though searching for a flaw, a crack in the composed man standing before him. "Where were you headed tonight?" Harris asked, his voice tighter now, the confidence from earlier replaced by something less steady. "Home," Liam answered evenly. "It's been a long day, and I was looking forward to getting there." The simplicity of the response seemed to irritate Harris further. "Long day doing what?" he pressed, stepping closer again. Liam tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Work. I don't see how that's relevant." "You don't get to decide what's relevant," Harris snapped. "Now answer the question." Liam's tone remained calm, almost disarming. "I'm a consultant. Meetings, reports, the usual." Harris scoffed, his smirk returning but with less conviction. "Consultant, huh? You seem pretty comfortable with how this works. You sure you don't have something to hide?" Liam's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing, letting the silence stretch. The quiet, unnerved Harris, who shifted on his feet before blurting, "Turn around and place your hands on the hood." Liam didn't move immediately. "Officer, I think we've established that I've done nothing wrong here. Is there a specific reason for this escalation?" The question landed heavily, but Harris refused to back down. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he barked. Liam exhaled slowly, his composure unwavering. "Fine." He turned and placed his palms flat against the cool surface of his car's hood, his movements deliberate and calm. Harris approached with quick, purposeful strides, his hands roughly patting Liam down. Each movement felt more about asserting dominance than genuine concern for safety. Liam didn't flinch, didn't stiffen. He simply stood there, unyielding in his calmness. "You're clean," Harris muttered, stepping back begrudgingly. Liam straightened and turned to face him, his eyes steady and piercing. "Of course I am," he said, his tone firm yet unprovoking. Harris clenched his jaw, his authority unraveling before his eyes. "You've got a lot of questions for someone who's supposed to be cooperating," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I believe in fairness and transparency, officer," Liam replied smoothly. "If those are a problem, perhaps we should both reassess this interaction." The words cut through the tension like a blade, and for a moment Harris said nothing. The power dynamic between them had shifted, and he could feel it slipping further out of his grasp. The silence grew heavy again, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city in the distance. Harris didn't like the way this was going, but he wasn't ready to back down. Harris's frustration was written all over his face, but Liam stood there unshaken, his expression calm and collected. The silence between them was thick with unspoken tension. Harris took a step closer, narrowing his eyes as if trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. "You seem awfully confident for someone pulled over for breaking the law," Harris said, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer," Liam replied. His voice was measured, even polite, but there was an edge to his words. "Respect is." The statement landed heavily, and for a moment, Harris faltered. His lips twitched as if he wanted to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he paced in a small circle, his hand tapping nervously on the holster at his belt. "Listen," Harris said finally, his voice rising slightly. "You think you can stand here and lecture me? You've got no idea what I deal with out here every day. And you assume you know everything about me based on what? A traffic stop? Liam countered, his tone still calm but now razor sharp. Harris stopped pacing and turned to face Liam, his eyes narrowing. You're awfully familiar with how this works. Care to explain why? Liam tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Let's just say I've had my fair share of interactions like this. Oh, yeah. Harris stepped closer, invading Liam's personal space. What are you, a lawyer or something? Or something, Liam replied ambiguously, his calm demeanor only fueling Harris's irritation. The officer's voice dropped to a near growl as he leaned in closer. You think you're smarter than me, don't you? Think you can talk your way out of this? Liam's gaze didn't waver. I don't think I'm smarter than you, officer. I think fairness and accountability are important. And right now, I'm not seeing much of either. Harris froze, the words hitting harder than he cared to admit. His hand hovered near his belt, a reflexive gesture that betrayed his frustration. You think you know how this is going to play out? Harris snapped. You've got no idea who you're dealing with. I could say the same to you, Liam said, his tone soft but loaded with meaning. Harris bristled at the response, his authority slipping further with every passing second. He tried to recover, pointing a finger at Liam as if to reassert control. You better watch yourself. People like you. People like me? Liam interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. Harris's jaw clenched, and he stepped back slightly as though realizing he'd said too much. You know what I mean? He muttered. I think I do, Liam said. His voice was still even, but the weight of his words was undeniable. And I think we both know this isn't about a traffic violation anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Harris opened his mouth as if to respond, but stopped himself. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and he was no longer the one in control. Officer, Liam said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. I think it's time you knew who I am. Harris frowned, confusion flickering across his face. I don't care who you are, he snapped, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Liam reached into his pocket slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. I'm reaching for my badge, he said calmly, watching Harris's hand twitch near his holster. There's no need for theatrics. The weight of his words hung in the air as he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. Harris's eyes widened as the truth hit him. My name is Liam Carter, he said, his tone casual but firm. Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. For a moment, Harris just stared at the badge, his expression frozen in disbelief. The name Liam Carter, etched into the gleaming surface, might as well have been a flashing sign announcing the officer's impending reckoning. His lips parted, but no words came out. The confident smirk he'd worn earlier, now replaced by an uneasy tightness. Internal Affairs, Harris repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Yes, Liam said calmly, slipping the badge back into his pocket. My job is to oversee officer conduct, to ensure the badge you wear represents fairness, integrity, and respect. Harris took a step back, the weight of the revelation sinking in. His hand dropped away from his belt, as if even the symbols of his authority were suddenly too heavy to bear. Harris started, but Liam didn't let him finish. Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been? Liam asked, his tone calm but piercing. He didn't wait for a reply. It's not the profiling, though that's bad enough. It's not even the baseless escalation. It's the fact that you did all of this without once considering who you were dealing with. Harris's face flushed red, his jaw tightening as he tried to maintain composure. I didn't mean... You assumed, Liam interrupted, his voice rising slightly but still controlled, that I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why is that, Officer Harris? Harris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched, every second feeling heavier than the last. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect, Liam answered for him. His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of an indictment. Harris looked down, unable to meet Liam's gaze. The shift in power was complete, and for the first time, Harris seemed unsure of himself. That's not just a problem for me, Liam continued, his voice steady and unyielding. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform. You swore an oath to protect and serve, not to judge and demean. Harris swallowed hard, his face pale now. The reality of the situation was dawning on him, and he knew there was no easy way out. Liam took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Here's what's going to happen, he said firmly. You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next. Harris hesitated, his lips parting as though to argue, but the look in Liam's eyes silenced him. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out Liam's license and registration. His hands trembled slightly as he handed them over. Liam took the documents without a word, tucking them neatly into his wallet. He moved toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing with one hand on the handle. He looked over his shoulder, meeting Harris's gaze one last time. "Remember this, Officer Harris," Liam said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." With that, Liam slid into his car and started the engine. The hum of the vehicle was the only sound as he pulled away, leaving Harris standing alone on the side of the road. The officer's once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a mixture of uncertainty and fear. As Liam drove home, the encounter replayed in his mind. Not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. This time, though, things would be different. This time, Liam had the authority to act, and he intended to use it. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Liam Carter's office at the Internal Affairs Division. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of traffic outside. On his desk sat an open file, Officer Greg Harris. Liam leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he studied the record. Harris's file wasn't spotless. Minor complaints dotted the pages, unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. They weren't enough to paint a damning picture on their own, but to Liam, they told a familiar story. This wasn't about one bad officer. Harris was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that Liam had seen far too often. The culture that allowed someone like Harris to feel justified in his actions didn't develop overnight, and it wouldn't change overnight either. A knock on the door pulled Liam from his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in, carrying a neat stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Carter," she said, placing the files on his desk. "Here's the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Chief Daniels also wanted to remind you about the department review next week." Liam nodded, offering a faint smile. "Thanks, Linda. Could you schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated for a moment, sensing the weight in Liam's tone. "Of course," she said before leaving the room. Alone again, Liam returned his attention to Harris's file. He flipped through the pages, but his focus wasn't just on Harris anymore. This was about something bigger. The department's training protocols, its accountability systems, everything needed scrutiny. Quiet reprimands and internal resolutions weren't enough. Liam thought about the previous night's encounter, replaying Harris's actions in his mind. The profiling, the escalation, the casual dismissal of respect. It wasn't just a reflection of one officer's behavior. It was a reflection of a system that allowed that behavior to thrive unchecked. He couldn't let this slide. Not this time. Liam closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as his thoughts churned. The badge Harris wore was supposed to stand for something more, something better. And it was Liam's job to make sure it did. When Linda returned later with confirmation of his meeting with Chief Daniels, Liam was ready. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't interested in bandaging bullet wounds. He wanted change, real, meaningful change. And this was where it would start. Liam sat across from Chief Daniels in the large windowless conference room. Daniels, a veteran officer with decades of service etched into his weathered face, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. The air between them was heavy with unspoken tension as Liam began to recount the previous night's encounter. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Liam said, his voice calm but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Harris's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of deeper problems within the department." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Harris's name has come up," he admitted. "We've addressed it before, quietly." "And that's the problem," Liam replied, leaning forward. His voice carried a quiet intensity, every word deliberate. Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. If we're not holding ourselves accountable, how can we expect the community to trust us? Daniel's expression hardened slightly, though not in anger. He was listening, but Liam could tell he was weighing every word, considering the political and institutional implications of what he was hearing. "So what are you proposing?" Daniels asked, his tone cautious. "A department-wide review," Liam said without hesitation. "Not just individual officers, but the entire system, training protocols, accountability measures, even the way complaints are handled. This isn't about one bad officer. It's about ensuring the badge stands for what it's supposed to: fairness, integrity, and respect." Daniel's fingers stopped tapping. He sat up straighter, his brows furrowing as he processed the suggestion. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this," he said finally. "Good," Liam replied simply. "It's about time someone did." Daniels let out a long breath, his gaze drifting to the stack of files on the table. "This kind of overhaul isn't going to be easy," he said. "There will be pushback from the officers, the union, even the community." "I'm not interested in easy," Liam said. His voice was steady, his determination unshakable. "I'm interested in change, and if that means stepping on a few toes, so be it." The room fell silent as Daniel studied Liam's face. Finally, he nodded slowly, though his expression remained grim. "You've got my attention," he said, "but you'd better be ready for the fallout." "I've been ready for years," Liam said. As the meeting ended, Liam felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be filled with resistance, but he welcomed the challenge. This wasn't just about Harris anymore. It was about fixing a system that had been broken for far too long. Liam left the room, a plan already forming in his mind. The ripple effect of this conversation would be felt far beyond the walls of the department. Change was coming. Weeks later, Liam stood at the podium in a packed community hall. Officers, city officials, and local residents filled the room, their eyes fixed on him. The air buzzed with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. This wasn't just another departmental meeting. This was the moment when the conversation about change would truly begin. Liam adjusted the microphone and scanned the room, his expression calm but determined. "Justice isn't just about enforcing the law," he began, his voice steady and resonant. "It's about fairness, integrity, and respect. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve uphold those values every single day." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience. Liam paused, letting the message sink in before continuing. "Last month, I had an interaction that reminded me just how much work we have left to do," he said. "An interaction that could have been written off as routine, but it wasn't. It exposed cracks in a system that we've ignored for too long." Liam glanced at the rows of officers sitting near the front, their faces a mixture of pride, discomfort, and reflection. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," he said. "It's about responsibility. It's about ensuring that the badge we wear stands for something more than authority. It stands for trust." He could see the ripple of reactions in the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and a few sat rigidly, their skepticism etched into their features. "We've begun a department-wide review," Liam continued. "We're examining everything: training protocols, complaint procedures, accountability systems. Change won't come easy, and it won't come overnight, but it will come." A murmur ran through the crowd. Liam could feel the weight of the room shifting, the skepticism giving way to a tentative hope. "I'm not asking for perfection," Liam said. "I'm asking for commitment. Commitment to a culture that values respect over power, accountability over complacency, and fairness over judgment." The applause started slowly, then grew louder, filling the hall with a thunderous resonance. Liam stepped back from the podium, letting the energy of the moment wash over him. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As he left the stage, he glanced at the faces in the crowd. Some still looked uncertain, but many now carried a spark of hope. Liam knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. Change had begun, and there was no turning back.